Hi, I'm Ginny Smith, and I've recently written a book called Overloaded, all about brain chemistry. I'm a regular on the Shambles Network, and for the book, I talked to another regular, Helen Czerski, about her experiences of living in a world of 24-hour sunshine. So we decided to recreate that chat for you here today. So one of the topics that I'm really interested in and that I'm covering in the book is sleep, and particularly our circadian rhythms and how that's controlled by our brains, but also how it's set by the outside world. So I really wanted to talk to someone who's had experience of living in an environment where there aren't those kind of normal cues of day and night that most of us are used to. And I know you've had a few experiences like that. So can you tell me a little bit about where you had those experiences and what it was like?
Yeah, so I study ocean science, and that has taken me out into the Arctic. And of course, above the Arctic Circle or below the Antarctic Circle, there are times of year where you get 24-hour daylight. And so I've worked in those environments for long periods of time. One was we were actually camping outside for a few weeks, which is you're a lot more exposed. And the other, I was in a big research ship at the North Pole for a couple of months, and we didn't see the sun didn't set the whole time. And the ships are sort of different environment, because obviously you can always go inside. By their nature, ships are made of metal and they've got walls, and so most of the inside of the ship doesn't have natural light. And actually it could come as a surprise when you went out and the outside of the ship didn't match the inside of the ship. But the common thing in both those environments, and this is universal basically in expedition stuff, is that even if nature doesn't give you a daily schedule, you have to keep one, because otherwise first of all, it's really confusing. Secondly, no one, it's, people tend to try and stay awake all the time, which isn't good for anyone. And thirdly, you'll just go mad. so humans have this very strong need for, is it today or tomorrow? And so actually humans in those environments absolutely impose an artificial clock, even if nature isn't giving it to you.
And did you find that you had any issues with your sleep, or any issues with kind of feeling hungry at the wrong times? Did your body get out of sync at all?
The hunger one is hard to tell, because basically in those environments you are working so physically hard, you're hungry all the time. I mean, like you eat whenever you're fed. The one thing that is actually also universal on ships, again, partly for reasons of organization, partly for reasons of discipline, is that meal times are super regular. If you are on a ship, a working ship, this is not some kind of cruise ship, lunch is at 12. If you are not there at 12, you do not get fed. End of. No, like that's it. So there are very rigorous meal times, and actually those really help in general, because when you're at sea, also the other thing you don't have is days of the week. So there is this feeling like how time passes is actually, it can all blur into one. And basically I have been known to say some of it is, there's an aspect of it which I feel is almost like I imagine prison must be, which is that nothing ever happens, but meal times keep coming around. And so meal times actually are the clock, and everything else sits relative to the meal times. So when it comes to sleep, I did, on one of those occasions, I did use, well, I was told to use, and in retrospect I was very glad, an eye mask, so that in a tent you've basically got light coming through all the time. So and some of us tried an eye mask, some of us didn't. I was in the trying the eye mask category, and actually it was really good, because as soon as you took it off, it was immediately daylight. Like it was, that was actually very helpful to sleep, because you went, okay, I know I need to go to bed really early at 8 p.m. I'm going to put my eye mask on and it's night. And so that was really easy. So yeah, so basically you impose routines, and if you don't have that, I mean, I have had periods where you do just have daylight all the time, and it's very hard to, I mean, it's a bit, so in lockdown time is passing in a weird way. It's a bit like that. You're never, you
It's
don't have a
really
feel for what
interesting.
time it is.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that those regular meals were really important, because actually that's something that experiments have found, that animals and humans can kind of hang on to anything that gives them a rhythm. So when you put an animal in all darkness or all light, or sometimes they do a version where they have sort of 2 hours light, 2 hours dark for the whole 24-hour cycle. So you're trying to take away any external cues of their body clock. They can keep it running if something is regular, whether that's a feeding time or even a kind of socialization time. As long as you have some regular cues, you can use those to train your body clock. So it's interesting to hear that they're doing that same thing on the boat.
In the case of my sister's Labrador, it's definitely food. But yeah, but it is, and the thing is, it's actually really settling. It's the fact that it's, the other thing that's interesting about it is it's so rigid. It's not, you know, approximately this time. It is, everyone is in the dinner queue at that time, and it's actually, we know we can we sort of assume that having freedom is better in life, and actually the most reassuring thing is having an anchor. And so it's actually really important to see when everything else is a bit weird, there is this anchor, and you do actually see, because the other thing about ship is you don't see people very often. You can't physically put everyone in the same room apart from at dinner time.
Okay.
So you see, so yeah, so those temporal anchors make a big difference. And the thing that was odd about the ship, I mean, the times I really noticed it were, as I said, you know, you'd be inside and you'd be playing the evening game, right? You just had dinner. Maybe it was a Saturday. Again, on the ship, it's very common to do something different on a Saturday, just to make it clear it's a weekend. So it's not a big difference. But on this particular Swedish ship, you know, at Saturday night, you're expected to, gently encouraged, however you phrase it, people did, sort of put on a slightly nicer shirt for dinner. It wasn't exactly dressing up, but you know, there might have been a tablecloth, and everyone just made a little bit more effort, and it did make a difference. You know, you're in the middle of the, like, you're at the North Pole, there's nothing around you for 500 miles. It doesn't make any difference or not, you know, how you turn up to dinner. But it was really like, oh, it's Saturday night, we're just going to have a bit of extra time. So after that Saturday night meal, you know, it's quite common for ships to have a social space. The countries that have alcohol allowed on board will have a bar. People don't get drunk really, but you know, 1 or 2 beers. And then I would occasionally go back to my stateroom, where I slept on the ship, outside, just to see the Arctic, and it would be daylight. And it'd be such a weird feeling, because you've just gone through this whole thing of having a nice Swedish evening with your friends, and outside it's, you know, blazing sunlight. It's quite, you know, quite often on a clear day, amazing landscapes, and it would feel very disorienting. And actually the only way to deal with that was to go back inside and hide from it, because otherwise you were just adrift.
You mentioned marking out times of the week, and I know that's something that a lot of people have found during this period of lockdown and when our routines have been disrupted. We've been very lucky in Singapore. We had 2 months of circuit breaker last May, June, and then since then we haven't been in lockdown, but we have still had some limitations. But within those 2 months, I noticed that same thing of the kind of the weekends started blurring into the weeks, with both myself and my husband working from home, and it would be very tempting to just do a bit more work on Saturdays. And we started making a concerted effort to get takeaway every Saturday night and just make that feel like something different. And I think partly that's down to how the brain stores memories, because when things are all very similar, the brain sort of takes a bit of a shortcut and goes, well, I'm not going to bother storing everything that's happened every Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, because it's all pretty much the same. But in normal life, we have a break in those routines and we often do something different at the weekend. So the brain stores that memory. So when you look back over a couple of months, you've got those special memories of things you did at the weekend that break it up. But when everything's the same, your brain just doesn't store the memories in the same way. So it's really interesting that you had that same thing, something to highlight a day of the week so that you remember it, and that helps with that feeling of time passing.
Well, you become an obsessive note taker, because it's quite so. And I mean, you know, I did some stuff on this at the start of lockdown, because part of the experience that I could pass on from having been at sea is that having a diary is really important. Even if you just write, didn't do much today, went out to the work site, you know, a penguin turned up, whichever hemisphere you're on. No penguins at the North Pole. But actually, otherwise there was no sense of time passing, and you can't remember when things happened because there's no visual reference, right? Every day is the same. You know, it might be cloudy or it might be sunny, but everything's the same. And actually writing it down becomes this really good record of it helps you feel time has passed. Because the other thing is, of course, you forget that your feelings change. You always assume that what you're feeling now is obvious, and of course you're going to remember feeling like this, and you totally don't. And one of the great things about keeping diaries in those environments is that I remember that day because I'd lost this thing and I was a bit grumpy because of that. And these little things happen, but it's enough to go, oh, that day was a bit different to the other days. And I do remember feeling different, even though if I looked back without the diary, I would have assumed that the way I think now is the way I always thought. And it's really valuable, I think, to remember, looking back at the expedition, because you have to obviously then do the science and do the analysis and remember, like, why was it I've got no data from this day? And then you have to piece the bits back together because you can't remember. There's no memory of why you did nothing that day, and you have to go, oh, the dispatcher went flat and then that thing broke and then we had to go back because there was a bear. And you have to be really organized about your memories, because like you say, your brain just doesn't hold on to them. Well, it would, they're in there, but I couldn't tell you whether they happened in July or the end of August.
Yeah, I'm actually finding a little bit of that with living in Singapore, because this is the first time I've lived somewhere that doesn't have distinct seasons, and I'm struggling a little bit with the sense of time passing on a longer span, because I sort of think back and I'm like, oh, well, we did this thing and it was hot and sunny and then it rained a bit, and I'm like, well, that could have been any time of year. Whereas in somewhere like the UK, you've got that element of what was the weather like. Oh, it must have been December or it must have been June. So it's quite interesting how we use these things to kind of hang on to memories and work out when they happened.
Well, also the mood that goes with it. So I lived in California for a while, and that also doesn't really have seasons. And after a year, it felt like Groundhog Day. I felt that time was not moving on, and I found it really frustrating. In my professional life, things were moving on. I was publishing papers, I was doing stuff, but it felt as a human as though nothing was changing. And I know clearly Californians are brought up there, they all seem to be fine. But being very used to this rhythm where there's always a last season or next, something's always changing. And that you're always going somewhere in a way, because if it's like, as we were recording this, the days are getting longer. So I know we're kind of going somewhere, we're going into summer. And I found living in California very hard because, well, I found after a year, I was very twitchy, put it that way, because it was like being stuck. My sense of time, I hadn't realized it was so attached to the weather. I lived all over the world, things change, but the planet turns, right? It's still got a tilt. Whichever hemisphere you're in, there's a physical relationship to the weather. And apparently that's how I anchor my sense of time, is in the earth spinning and the season. And so when that's taken away, it's extremely disorienting. And it adds a lot to, I think this is very relevant in lockdown as well, that it's close to torture to have that taken away. I mean, it's not to feel as though, or at least for a Western mind.
I was just going to say, for anyone Californian listening, Helen is not saying that living in California is torture. I don't think.
But I mean, as a way, if you take, I mean, because this is used, sort of in prisons where they have constant lights all the time, or it's random, and it is, it's deliberately disorienting. And the human mind is like, where am I? Where do I fit? Where do I, and so I think that's one of the reasons, ships are very controlled environments for lots of reasons. They're really interesting, but the thing that's most interesting about them is that they have to construct a lot of the things that normally you would take for granted. And that construction has to be so careful, because if it goes wrong, it goes very, very, very wrong. Because if you have a mutiny at sea because everyone is miserable, that's a really serious situation. So over centuries, this is one of the reasons that life at sea has a reputation for being very regimented. It's partly a discipline thing, because you need someone to be, when they're told to pull on the rope, they have to pull on the rope for the sake of everyone on the ship. You definitely need them to do that thing. But if you look at the seafarers' records from the past, and you look at the logbooks of captains, they will talk about keeping the crew almost entertained, like giving this, various captains phrased it in different ways. Some of them are giving the crew things to do to shut them up, basically, but some of them are like, they need a sense of purpose. We have to do a thing, it's not just scrubbing the decks. It's like, oh, now the decks are scrubbed, something's moved on. And so ships are this really interesting microcosm of having to control time, even when the day-night cycle is there. You're having to, if you just woke up one day on the ship just from the sun without anything else, you can't tell what direction is what time of day it is, really. So you have to impose it. And so all of these ways that ships are run at sea is actually partly an attempt to keep the human mind sane. And, there was a lot of nasty behavior on those ships, let's say. There were certainly captains who had a shocking record of treating their men badly. However, they did all recognize that there were some basics that humans just need to stay sane, and they had to construct them. And that's where these rigorous shift patterns and things come from. Now, watches are all a bit, watches when you start work on a ship and stop work at specific times, some of them are a bit weird. Very odd. In fact, I think the Royal Navy didn't take on a 24-hour regular shift pattern until something like 1920. It's really silly. But
Wow.
the point is, at sea you have to construct those things. And
Well,
so it's deliberate.
Yeah, it's really interesting. There haven't been a huge number of studies on humans, because, as you say, it is effectively torture. But the few that have been done have shown that if you take away all those cues, humans drift out of sync very, very quickly within a few days. And it's you can drift by something like 15, 20 minutes a day. So within a week, you can be a couple of hours out of sync. And we tend to drift later. So we tend to start going to bed later and getting up later, kind of as you go. And we rely on light most of the time to set that rhythm and to stay in our 24-hour cycle.
Well, the interesting thing about that
unless
is,
we can't.
So on a ship, when you have daylight, there are still night owls and larks. So even when there is literally no reason for you not to just decide that it's 6 a.m. instead of 10 a.m. and so you're effectively getting up early instead of late, there are still night owls and day owls. And actually, so at the other end of the planet, and Bird Island, which is a tiny island off Antarctica, it's a tiny research base. There's basically something like 16 people there in the summer to monitor the birds on the island, right? And by convention, they keep the same time as Halley base, I think, can't quite remember. Anyway, birds get up early in the morning. And so we were dropping off supplies for them, and I was talking, and they said, well, the birds get up at 6 a.m. on our actual time zone, as the planet goes. So we didn't want to get up that early. So we reset all the clocks so that the time the birds started singing was 10 a.m. And then they all felt better. And it's like, there's literally no difference, right? You getting up 8 hours after you went to bed or whatever it is. And yet it made them so much happier to think that they could roll out of bed and start work at 10 a.m. rather than having to get up at the crack of dawn. Entirely artificial. Really interesting.
Well, Singapore is out of sync with other countries that it should be in sync with. We're an hour different from people that we're kind of directly above and below. I'm not entirely sure why, but it's better. So it gets light here at sort of between 6 and 7, whereas when I've been to Indonesia and other places in this area, it gets light very, very early. I remember being woken up by light at 5 a.m. So I don't know who decided that was a thing, but it feels, and also it gets dark an hour later, so it doesn't get dark till 7 o'clock, whereas in other places similar, is it latitude or longitude, which is the latitude. One that I mean,
longitude is one you longitude that way.
It gets dark at sort of 5, 6 o'clock. So I remember being quite surprised when we moved here that it got dark so late, but it's because for some reason we're an hour shifted. Someone just decided that was better for Singapore at some point.
But the clock shifting is interesting, isn't it? Because again, it sort of becomes obvious that it's artificial, but everyone needs the reference. No one would say, we're just going to go back to do whatever you want, So it would be really interesting, I think, to do the thoughts. I mean, there are probably still societies who live mostly without clocks, but we have become so mentally dependent on the clock, like knowing whether it's 7 a.m. or 8 a.m. makes a big difference to us.
It would be really hard to set up Zoom meetings if you didn't have clocks.
But in principle, if you live in an agricultural village in the 17th century and, you've got to feed some pigs at some point, but that's what you've got to do today, right? Feed some pigs, make some food, all of these things. It would be, in a way, it's unfettered, but there might be a church clock, a church bell maybe on a Sunday, perhaps something like that. But I wonder how different their behavior was, how much it's artificial. Like our mental attachment to the clock it was an attachment to something else. And it's moved on. I don't know. Some anthropologists might know, but it's not me.
Well, I think there is some evidence that some drives like hunger are as much determined by our expectations based on the clock as anything else. So, you see that it's 1:45 and you start feeling hungry, but that's kind of a learned association between the time and it being lunchtime. So it'd be really interesting. Yeah, if you lived without clocks, how often would you eat? How often would you feel hungry? All of those kinds of things. Be really interesting to know.
No idea, but I definitely think that if you're camping and things like that, then irregular meals also becomes very difficult to track how much you've eaten and that kind of thing as well. We're more creatures of routine than we like to think, I would say. But it's very, you put humans in environments where they have to deliberately generate it, and people it's intuitive. People know you sort of need meals at these kind of times, you sort of need sleep at this kind of time. There might be variations, but it's very universal.
Interesting. You've mainly, or your trips have all been in the time when it's 24 hours sun. I guess that makes sense, because you wouldn't want to try and do science with no light at all.
Well, so people did. So just this last, let's see, a year, they got back a year ago. But Mosaic, there was a massive Arctic expedition where they were over the polar night. They were in the ship in the North Pole over the polar night. And so it's not only dark, but it's -40. So in that, and they were working, I mean, you've got gear, but still, that's pretty cold. So it's dark all the time, big floodlights from the ship. So I wasn't there, but some of my close colleagues were on that ship. And I think they sort of accept the dark after a while, because there's no alternative, right? Humans kind of accept what you get. But I think also in that situation, there's no incentive to be outside. Very little incentive to be outside. So when it's sunny, you might go, oh, it's sunny, I'll go out. Whereas if it's dark, you kind of go, oh, it's dark, right? Shut the window again, shut the door, hide from it. So I think it's probably not as dramatic in that case. Although I can see that if you were I mean, this is the reason no one does Arctic expeditions during the polar night, because it would be stupid. But I can see that being very hard mentally. I mean, you see the stars rotate, but nothing else.
I was reading about people who live north of the Arctic Circle, and I was quite surprised that there's more insomnia during the Arctic night than the Arctic day, because kind of instinctively I would think it would be harder to sleep when it's light all the time, but actually we need that light to set our circadian rhythms, and without any light at all, your body doesn't know when to release melatonin. So actually it tends to be midwinter insomnia that people suffer from there, which I found quite interesting.
Well, one of the other things that's quite interesting about being on the ship, just thinking about the stars going around, and this is true during the polar day, I've certainly seen this, is so the way, if you're doing what we were doing, which is that in both cases, actually, both the polar night expedition that I didn't do and the polar day one that I did, the ship's set up to drift, so it's just following the ice around it. So basically it's moored to a large piece of ice and it just goes wherever the ice goes. And it does happen, obviously, that the ice rotates. It's on top of a spinning planet. So you don't actually know. So you would think that, you point the ship this way, and then at least, the Earth's spinning, so you know what, where the sun is going to be. It's like a clock, but it doesn't work like that, because the ship itself is changing orientation. So you don't have any reference to the natural clock in the sky. I mean, it does get a bit closer to the horizon and goes back up a bit, but it's usually so low it doesn't make much difference.
But it's not like it moves from left to right or anything.
And you don't know if it's on the left hand side of the ship that this must be morning, and if it's on the right hand side it must be night. And the same with the stars during the polar night, right? There's no, you could see which orientation the stars are in, at least they stay still. But you're still potentially shifting, unless you're completely frozen in. But even then, the ice could potentially rotate. So yeah, those natural cues can be removed in a pretty significant way.
Interesting. Well, thank you so much for chatting to me about that, and it was great to have your stories in the book as well. It's really interesting to hear people's kind of actual experiences of these things as well as the science. So yeah, thank you.
You're very welcome.
Thanks so much to Helen for joining me, and thanks to you for watching. My book Overloaded is available now. If you search Ginny Smith Overloaded in wherever you prefer to buy your books from, you should be able to find it. And do stay tuned to the Cosmic Shambles Network for loads more great content.